The paw struck the ice one more time, without strength, without direction. The body that hadn't yet accepted it had stopped. The cub had been trapped since before dawn. It had fallen into a narrow crevice covered in snow. One of the 1,000 invisible deceits the Alaskan tiger scatters across the ground like authorless traps. The opening was wide enough to suck in a small body. It was not wide enough to give it back. Outside, 70 degrees, the mother bear dug. She had been at it for hours. Her claws gouged trenches in the ice around the crevice, scratching the edges, trying to widen what nature had sealed. But her paws were too large. Her toes couldn't reach. Each attempt pushed the cub an inch deeper before dropping it back. She tried again, and again. The forest did not answer. The Alaskan tiger has no witnesses. It has no neighbors. It has no one to walk by and turn their head. It has only pine trees with snow up to their lowest branches, and a silence so thick it seems to have weight. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, that suffocates. The cub made a sound. Weak, muffled by the ice, spaced out enough to be frightening, not because of the volume, but because of the interval between them. Anyone who knows animals knows what it means when sounds start getting further apart. It means the effort is costing more than the body can pay. The bear stopped. She stood motionless over the crevice for a few seconds, her breath condensed into white clouds that the wind immediately carried away. The pale patch on her left ear, the only detail distinguishing her from any other bear in that forest, was covered in thin ice. She looked at the crevice, then she lifted her head and looked toward the cabin. There was still nothing between her and the cabin, just 800 yards of deep snow and the beginning of something that doesn't exist in any animal behavior book. In that moment, no camera was recording, no scientist was observing. There was only a mother at the absolute limit of what instinct can do, and a decision no animal should ever have to make. She started walking, heavy, deliberate, without the caution bears have around humans, as if she knew exactly where she was going and what she needed to ask for. If you've made it to this moment without blinking, you already know this story is unlike anything you've ever seen. Subscribe to the channel now and hit the bell, because what happens next will stay with you forever. 2 months earlier, in that same forest, his world had the size of a den. That was it. A hollow dug beneath the roots of a centuries-old pine, lined with fur and dry leaves his mother had carried in over weeks before winter closed in. The space was small, dark, warm in a way that exists nowhere else. The heat that comes from inside another body, not from fire, not from a blanket. The kind of warmth that teaches a newborn the world is safe before they know what danger is. He was born at the worst time of the year. Outside, the Alaskan bush was in the dead darkness of January. Temperatures that kill in minutes anyone who isn't prepared. Blizzards that change the geography of the snow from 1 hour to the next. Inside the den, none of that existed. There was the mother's warmth, the rhythm of her breathing covering his like a second skin, and the milk that arrived whenever he searched for it. He was the only one in the litter. That means one simple, absolute thing. All the warmth was his. All the attention was his. Every move his mother made in the den was calibrated around him. When she shifted in her sleep, it was slow, so as not to wake him. When he whimpered, she answered with a low, guttural sound, always the same, always on the same frequency, that made him stop in seconds. He didn't know he was vulnerable. That is what makes any creature's childhood bearable, the ignorance of danger. He grew up those weeks believing the cold was something that existed in his mother's fur when she came back from outside, that the world beyond the den was just an extension of the warmth inside, that it was all there was. Then, on a morning that promised weak sun through the clouds, he followed. His mother had gone out to feed, the first long separation since birth. He waited. He sniffed the den's opening. He put one paw outside. then another. The cold hit him like a wall, but he didn't back down. He was curious the way only the very young can be. With no memory of consequences, he walked 6 feet, then 12. The snow gave way under his weight differently than the den floor. It sank. Every step demanded more effort than the last, but there was light. There were smells the den had never had. There was the sound of the wind in the pines that up close sounded like breathing, massive, constant, alive. He didn't see the crevice. It was covered. A thin layer of snow had formed over the opening during the night, uniform enough to look like solid ground. He stepped without hesitation. The ground gave way, and in less than 2 seconds, what was exploration turned into a fall, and what was a fall turned into a prison. The crevice was wide enough to trap him by the belly, front paws facing up, impossible to turn around, impossible to break free. The temperature inside was even lower than on the surface. The ice held the cold like a vault. He vocalized, loudly at first, then weaker, then in intervals. His mother heard from a distance and came running back. Martha Collins woke up that morning, the same way she woke up every morning since Arthur died, with a list, not a written list, a mental list, repeated in a low voice while the coffee warmed on the cast-iron stove. Chop wood, check the flower stock, fix the latch on the north window that squeaked when it was windy. Feed the birds that came to the sill. A habit of Arthur's she had inherited without realizing. The list wasn't organization, it was resistance. Martha knew, with the clarity of someone who had spent 3 winters alone, staring at the same walls, that the day she stopped having a list was the day she stopped, not working, wanting to go on. 73 years old, hands that ached more with each passing winter. The arthritis had worsened the second winter without Arthur, as if her body had decided to register his absence in her bones. On very cold days, she couldn't close her fingers completely. On days like that one, 70 degrees before 8 in the morning, she wore 2 overlapping gloves and still felt the pain like a constant grip that gave no quarter. But the list went on. She was on the threshold, the axe in her right hand, the first birch log already positioned, when she heard the footsteps. Heavy, rhythmic, without the caution wild animals normally have when approaching humans. Martha didn't turn around immediately. She had learned from Arthur that sudden movements were mistake number 1. She lowered the axe slowly, breathed, and then turned her body with the slowness of someone who has lived long enough to know that rushing rarely helps. The bear was 40 feet away, motionless in the snow, looking straight at her. There was no threat in the animal's body. There wasn't the muscular tension that precedes an attack. Arthur had described it so many times that Martha knew it by heart. There was something else, something Martha couldn't name yet, but which made her stomach turn in a way different from fear. The bear didn't advance, didn't retreat, just waited, and the weather outside kept dropping. That same morning, before Martha put the axe down, other people had passed through that forest. None of them stopped. The first was Wayne. 42 years old, fox trapper, knew the bush like his own backyard. He had headed out before dawn, crossed the area at 6 in the morning, and seen the bear from a distance, digging at something on the ground, agitated, off-baseline behavior. He stopped, watched for maybe 30 seconds. Then he adjusted the rifle on his shoulder and took the opposite path without hesitation. It wasn't cowardice, it was calculation. A sow with a cub is the only thing in the bush that attacks unprovoked, he would tell an acquaintance later at the gas station. You don't go near. Nobody in their right mind goes near. That's rule number 1. Wayne's rule number 1 wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete. 2 hours later, a white Ford F-150 with Fairbanks plates passed down the dirt road, cutting through the forest 1.5 miles from the crevice. Inside, 2 researchers from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game were returning from collecting soil samples in the tundra further north. They saw the bear from the window, now walking in circles near the same area, the behavior still abnormal. The younger of the two, David, suggested stopping. The older one, Scott, checked his watch. "We have to deliver the samples by 3. If we stop now, we won't make it." David looked out the rear window as the truck drove on. The bear shrank until she disappeared among the pines. He didn't say anything else. Scott wasn't a cruel man. He was a man with a deadline. There is a difference. But for the cub trapped in the ice, that difference didn't exist. Around 10 in the morning, Martha tried the radio. Alex answered on the second ring, as always. She described what she had seen: the bear 40 feet away, motionless, the behavior that didn't feel like a threat. His voice came through the static, firm. "Martha, don't go out there. A sow with a cub acting strange is the absolute worst-case scenario. She could be rabid, she could be hurt, she could be defending a kill site you don't even know is there. Call the authorities." "Alex!" Martha looked out the window. The bear was still there. "What authorities? Within a 30-mile radius." Silence on the radio. "Then stay inside. Lock the door and stay inside until she leaves." Martha didn't answer. She turned off the radio carefully, as she always did. Arthur had said once that equipment treated with care lasts twice as long, and she had never forgotten. Alex wasn't indifferent. He was distant. 34 miles of deep snow turn any concern into helplessness, and helplessness has a way of sounding like coldness when it comes through a radio. But Martha stood looking at the door for 40 minutes. 40 minutes in which she herself was the fourth person to take no action, in which her arthritic hands, Arthur's voice in her memory, and the entirely legitimate fear of an adult grizzly kept her frozen inside. She wasn't proud of it. Sometimes indifference doesn't have the face of a monster. It has the face of a reasonable person weighing real risks with incomplete information. It has the face of a scientist with a deadline, a trapper with a rule, a distant neighbor who cares but can't do anything. The problem is that for someone trapped in the ice, reasonable and indifferent achieve the same result. And outside, the bear was still waiting. Motionless, patient, with a certainty in her body that none of the four had recognized. Martha hadn't opened the door yet, but she was standing, facing it. Inside the crevice, time worked differently. There was no light. There was no reference of surface, up, down, beyond the weight of his own body against the ice. There was only the cold, not as a temperature, but as a physical presence, as something pushing from all sides at once, entering through his breath and coming out less warm than it went in. The cub had stopped fighting. Not out of surrender. The body had simply redistributed what energy remained to the functions that still mattered: heart, lungs, the core heat in the center of the chest. The front paws that used to thrash toward the surface now moved only in long intervals, reflexes rather than intention, the body doing what bodies do when consciousness starts to retreat. The whimpers had changed frequency. They were no longer calls, they were exhalations, the involuntary sound of a chest breathing against resistance, spaced out, increasingly spaced out. The interval between them had doubled since dawn and kept growing with the silent precision of a clock nobody had asked to tick. Outside, the bear was at the edge of the crevice again. She had gone to the cabin and come back 3 times that morning. Each trip was faster than the last, as if the distance between the cub and the only chance of help was an equation she recalculated with every pass. Now she stood over the opening, snout inside the crevice, inhaling the cub's scent with the intensity of someone who needs to confirm he is still there. He still was. But the interval between the sounds had started to stretch again. The cold at 70 degrees gives no warning. There is no perceptible gradation for the one inside. There is no moment when it gets too cold, because too cold is already the starting line. What exists is a progressive slowdown. Processes decelerate so gradually they seem normal until they are no longer reversible. The cub didn't know this. He only felt the heat in the center of his chest getting smaller, like a flame in a closed room consuming its own oxygen. Not with pain, with distance. The world up above getting further away, not because he was sinking, but because his capacity to care about it was fading. On the surface, the mother heard the last whimper before the silence. She stood still for 4 seconds that seemed to have their own duration, their own weight. Then she lifted her head in a way that wasn't defeat. It was concentrated urgency, and she started walking toward the cabin for the 4th time. There was no more time to wait for someone to understand. Inside the cabin, Martha had been facing the door for 40 minutes, her gloves still on, the iron hook leaning against the wall beside it, a tool she used to pull logs from the pile without having to bend down and strain her back. It was 30 inches long, thick wooden handle, recurved forged iron tip. She had looked at it 3 times in those 40 minutes. She wasn't thinking about the hook. She was thinking about Arthur, about how he had described once, sitting at this very kitchen table, what happens when a full-grown grizzly decides you're a threat. The description wasn't long. It didn't need to be. It had been enough for Martha, never in 22 years in the bush, to get within 200 yards of a bear. 40 feet. The bear had been 40 feet from her that morning. Martha looked at Arthur's picture on the wall. He was smiling with his hat askew, the forest behind him, a summer that seemed impossible from here. She didn't ask for permission. She wasn't the kind of woman who asks ghosts for permission. But she kept looking for a moment longer than necessary. Then the joints in her hands throbbed, the cold outside pressing on the knuckles, even through the walls. And Martha had a very simple, very clear thought, the kind that only comes when reasoning stops tangling in on itself. She was dying anyway. Not right now, not today, probably. But slowly, winter by winter, routine by routine, the life she had built with Arthur was becoming just the habits left over after he was gone. And habits without purpose are just postponements. The iron hook was 2 steps away. The bear appeared at the window, not threatening, just looking. The pale patch on her left ear turned toward the glass, her snout misting against the cold, her dark, fixed eyes holding something Martha recognized before she had the words to name it. It was the same look she'd seen in the mirror for 3 winters. Someone asking for help without knowing if they'd be heard. Martha grabbed the hook. Martha Collins was 73 years old, had severe arthritis in both hands, and no practical reason to open that door. That she knew clearly. She also knew she weighed 130 pounds, that a female grizzly can top 600, and that the distance between the cabin and the crevice she had roughly located by the direction the bear kept returning from was at least 800 yards of deep snow at 70 degrees Celsius. With her hands the way they were that morning, fingers locking at the joints, pain radiating to the elbow when she tried to make a fist, she couldn't even grip the hook's handle with full force. She was no hero, never had been. She was a woman who had come to Alaska at 26, because Arthur had come first, and she had decided that wherever he was where she wanted to be. They had built the cabin together over 2 summers. They had buried 2 dogs, a horse, and the plans for children that never came. They had survived winters that killed younger, stronger neighbors. She had survived all of that, but the 3 winters alone had exacted a toll that didn't show in her bones. It showed in the quiet moments, when the coffee was ready and she poured 2 mugs out of habit before realizing. When she woke up at 3 in the morning, and the right side of the bed was cold, and it took her a few seconds to remember why. That was the wound the arthritis couldn't explain. Martha put on her heavy parka, her wool overcoat on top of that, the 2 overlapping gloves on the hands that throbbed. She wrapped her scarf up to her chin. She gripped the iron hook with both hands and stood for a moment in the center of the kitchen. She spoke out loud, as she did when she needed to think. Arthur used to say you don't go near a sow with a cub. Pause. But Arthur wasn't a 73-year-old woman who doesn't have much left to lose. It wasn't bravado. It was arithmetic. She keyed the radio one last time. Alex answered fast. He had been worried since the last call, she could tell by his tone. "Martha, tell me you're inside the house. I'm heading out." "Martha, for the love of God." "Alex." Her voice came out calm, the way it gets calm when the decision has already been made, and what comes next is just communication. "If I don't check in by noon, you call the Fort Yukon outpost and have them send someone to check. Write that down." "You can't." "Write it down, Alex." A long pause, then the sound of paper. "Got it." "Thank you." She turned off the radio. Then she stared at it for a second. The old rig, the bent antenna Arthur had fixed with baling wire 3 times. She ran her thumb along the side, slowly. Then she turned to the door. The bear was outside waiting, just as she had been all the other times. But this time there was something different in the animal's body. A more tense stillness, like a coiled spring. As if she knew that this time the door was going to open. Martha pushed. The cold entered like a solid wall. She didn't flinch. She stood on the threshold, the two of them looking at each other, the small woman with the iron hook and the heavy coat, and the massive bear with the pale patch on her left ear and white steam blowing from her nostrils. 3 seconds. 5. Then the bear turned her body and began walking toward the tree line, slowly, pausing every 4 or 5 steps, looking back. Martha recognized that. It was the same gesture Arthur made when he wanted her to follow him without having to ask. She stepped down the 2 porch stairs and went. "You are watching one of the most extraordinary stories ever told here. Write the name of your city in the comments. You'll be surprised how many people are watching from the exact same place as you, feeling exactly what you're feeling right now." The bear walked ahead. Martha followed 10 feet behind, close enough not to lose the track in the snow, far enough away that the animal wouldn't feel pressured. It was a distance she had calculated instinctively, without knowing she was calculating. Sometimes the body is wiser than the head when a situation has no precedent. The cold burned the exposed part of her face, the narrow strip between the scarf and the beanie she hadn't covered because she hadn't expected to need to go outside. Every inhale reached her lungs freezing cold, and Martha focused on breathing through her nose, slowly, like Arthur had taught her. Through the nose the cold buffers before it gets inside. Through the mouth you freeze from the inside out. The bear didn't look back the whole time, just every now and then. A check-in, not a plea. As if she already knew Martha was coming and just needed to confirm. 800 yards of deep snow at 70 degrees. Martha counted her steps until she stopped counting. When they arrived, she saw the crevice before she saw the cub, an irregular opening in the snow-covered ground, the edges dug out and clawed into an arch, the record of hours of trying. The bear stopped 3 feet from the edge and stood still, her snout pointed down, her nostrils flaring. Martha approached slowly, kneeled in the snow. Her knee joints protested with a dry pop that she ignored. She leaned her torso over the crevice and looked inside. The darkness was almost total, but there was enough ambient light for her to make out the shape of the cub, small, motionless, front paws up, its breath condensing into a thin, erratic mist. Alive. For how long she didn't know. Martha pulled the glove off her right hand with her teeth, the hand that hurt the most, but was the most nimble. She dug her fingers into the snow around the rim of the crevice, probing the thickness of the ice. Then she gripped the hook with both hands and positioned the recurved tip on the narrowest edge of the opening. "It's going to hurt the hands," she said quietly. To herself, not the bear. "It's going to hurt a lot. You already know that." She applied pressure. The ice resisted. She applied more pressure, pulling her upper body weight up against the hook, her arms shaking not just from the cold, but from the strain the inflamed joints weren't supposed to be taking. A crack. A fissure opened on the edge, mere inches, But inches mattered. The bear didn't move. She stayed exactly where she was, body tense, watching Martha's every movement with a focus that had nothing animal about it. It had the concentrated quality of someone who understands what is being done and chooses not to interfere. Martha worked for 23 minutes. She figured out the time later when she tried to piece it together. In the moment there was no time. There was only the ice, the hook, the pressure, and the sound of her own teeth clenched against the pane. The opening widened in small, irregular, adequate increments. When she judged there was enough clearance, she leaned her torso over the crevice and sank both arms inside. Her fingers found fur, thick, freezing on the surface, with a residue of heat deep down near the skin. The cub didn't react to the touch, which would have frightened Martha if she didn't know that advanced hypothermia does exactly that, shutting down surface reflexes top to bottom while guarding the core. She adjusted her knees in the snow, held her breath, and pulled. She felt the moment the body cleared the crevice, the way she'd felt when Arthur pulled the first massive log that had gotten stuck under the snow in a long-ago winter. A resistance, then a giving way, then a weight that is suddenly entirely in your arms. The cub was in her arms. Martha sat still for a second in the snow, holding that small, heavy mass against her chest. He was cold in a way that scares you. Not the surface cold, but the cold that comes from within. But his chest was moving. Barely, but moving. She bundled him inside her overcoat without thinking, unzipping it and pressing the cub against her own chest, pulling the fabric around him as best she could with hands that weren't obeying properly anymore. Her own body heat was all there was. There was nothing else. The bear took a step toward her. Martha raised her eyes. The two looked at each other from less than 6 feet away, the closest they'd been since this whole thing started. The bear lowered her snout toward the coat, sniffed for 2 long seconds, then took a step back. It wasn't a threat. It was a check. "He's right here," Martha said quietly. "I'll take care of him." It made no sense to speak. She knew it made no sense. She spoke anyway. The trek back was slower. Martha carried the cub's weight against her chest with her arms crossed under the overcoat, every step calculated not to slip, not to fall, not to let the cold blow in through the opening of the coat. The bear walked beside her, not in front, not behind, beside, 5 feet away. When they reached the cabin, Martha climbed the 2 porch steps and stopped. The bear stayed at the bottom. They looked at each other. Martha nodded. It wasn't a decision, it was a reflex. Then she went inside, shoved the door shut with her elbow, and went straight to the stove. 3 days. The cub stayed in the cabin for 3 days. Martha warmed him with a hot water kettle wrapped in a cloth, with the wool blanket that had belonged to her and Arthur. With the heat of the cast-iron stove, she kept roaring without interruption for the first time since she'd gone on fixed firewood rations. She woke every 2 hours to check his temperature, to lay her palm flat against his chest, to confirm the movement. "It's over," she kept saying, always the same phrase. "It's over. You're here." The same words she had said to Arthur on the nights of high fever during the second winter. The same words no one had said to her in the 3 winters since. On the second day, the cub opened his eyes. Martha had her back turned, stirring a pot on the stove, when she heard a sound, low, guttural, different from the faint whimpers of the early hours. She turned around. The cub had his eyes open, his head lifted a few inches, his snout sniffing the cabin air with an intensity that looked like a massive effort. She didn't approach immediately. She stood where she was, spoon in hand, and let him look, let him sniff, let him decide the environment was safe before closing the distance. Only after a full minute did she walk slowly over, kneel on the cold wood floor, and place the back of her hand, not the palm, the back, less threatening, near his snout. He sniffed it, didn't pull back. Martha noticed the mark then, A white patch behind his left ear, small, precise, identical in placement to his mother's. Same side, same irregular shape. She stared at it longer than she should have. "You really are her boy, aren't you?" she said softly. Outside, the bear had stayed all 3 days, never more than 30 feet from the door, never leaving, just waiting. On the 3rd day, Martha carried the cub to the threshold. She held him in both arms. He already weighed more than he looked, and her hands protested the strain, but she didn't let go. She stepped down the 2 stairs slowly, stopped in the snow, and lowered her body until she set the cub on the ground with the care used for fragile things. The bear was 25 feet away. She advanced immediately, not at a run, but with long, deliberate strides that closed the gap in seconds. Martha stayed dead still. She knew she had to stay still. Her heart said otherwise, but she'd learned long ago not to listen to her heart when logic and survival spoke louder. The bear lowered her snout to the cub. She sniffed for a long time. The cub reacted to his mother's scent with his whole body. A tremor that wasn't cold, it was recognition. He started shifting in the snow, his paws still shaky, but working. The bear kept sniffing, his neck, his flanks, the white patch behind his left ear. Then she raised her head toward Martha. That look lasted longer than Martha had expected. There was no threat. There was no gratitude in the human sense. Martha wasn't naive enough to project that. There was just the direct acknowledgement of a presence, the kind of attention given to something that matters. Then the bear turned her body. The cub followed her with faltering steps, sinking into the snow up to his belly every 2 or 3 paces, but moving forward. They vanished into the pines in less than a minute. Martha stood in the snow until she couldn't see either of them anymore. Then she went back inside, shut the door, and stood in the center of the kitchen for a time she couldn't measure, staring at the folded blanket in the corner where the cub had slept for 3 days. The cabin was quiet. Quieter than before, but which she hadn't thought possible. The next morning, her hands wouldn't obey. It wasn't the usual ache of arthritis. It was something else, a stiffness that started in the knuckles and climbed up her wrist to her forearm, as if the tissue had decided, after 3 days of exertion in extreme cold, to present the bill all at once. Martha tried to wrap her right hand around her coffee mug handle, and her fingers responded with a spasm that dropped the mug to the floor. She stood staring at the white porcelain shards on the hardwood. It was Arthur's mug. She stared for a long time. Then she bent down, with the difficulty bending required now, and gathered the pieces one by one with the fingertips that still worked. Without wood, the cabin drops freezing in 2 hours. Without heat, you don't survive a deep Alaskan winter. And without hands, there's no way to chop wood. Martha spent the morning trying out solutions. The first was simple and humiliating. She used her feet to snap the smaller pieces of birch sitting by the door, pieces that didn't need the axe, just pressure. It worked. Slow, awkward, but it worked. She fed the stove with that and bought herself a few hours. The second was harder to admit. There was an old, solid wood chair in the bedroom she didn't use anymore, one Arthur had made that first summer out of leftover cabin material. Martha stood in the bedroom doorway, looking at it for 15 minutes. Then she fetched the chair and set it next to the stove. She didn't smash it yet, but she knew she would, if she had to. And that unsettled her in a way the cold couldn't, the idea of burning the things Arthur had made in order to stay alive without him. Alex called on the radio that afternoon. She told him about her hands. She didn't tell him about the chair. Martha. His voice had a different quality this time, less calculus, more genuine worry. You need to consider coming into town, at least for the rest of the winter. My wife already said we've got room. Alex. Listen, you spent 3 days carrying a bear on your chest at 70 below zero, with arthritis in your hands. Any doctor hearing this would have you committed. There's no doctor for 30 miles. That is exactly the problem. Martha looked out the window. The clearing was empty. The pines were heavy with snow. Everything looked exactly like any other day in the last 3 winters, except now there were paw prints in the snow around the cabin, large, spaced out, circling the perimeter that hadn't been there the day before. The bear had returned during the night, circled the cabin, and left. "I'm staying here," Martha said. "Why?" Alex's question wasn't aggressive, it was genuine. He wanted to understand. She was silent for a moment then, "Because for the first time in 3 winters, I need to know what happens next." Alex didn't answer right away. When he did, it was simply, "You call me every day, not every week, every day." She agreed. The second week was worse than the first. Her hands improved marginally. She wrapped them in cloths, warmed on the stove, for an hour before doing any work, a technique Arthur had found in an old country medicine book still on the shelf. It helped. It didn't cure. She ate once a day to stretch her supplies. She figured she had provisions for 3 more weeks if she was careful, 6 if she was strict. She was being strict. She lost weight she didn't have to lose. She slept in 3 layers of clothing because the firewood was now rationed to the absolute minimum needed to keep the temperature above the critical point. On the 10th night, the temp inside the cabin dropped to 37 degrees before dawn. She woke up with her own breath condensing on her face and rushed to feed the stove with the 2 emergency logs she'd set aside. She sat by the stove until daylight broke, knees pulled to her chest, hands wrapped around the mug that had replaced Arthur's. "It's getting hard, Arthur," she said quietly. The picture on the wall didn't answer. It never did. But there was a quality in the silence after she spoke that was different from the silence before, as if the air recognized the name and made room for it. In the 3rd week, the cub almost made her give up. Not the cub itself. He had vanished into the woods with his mother, and Martha assumed he was fine. It was what happened one afternoon when she was on the porch checking the usual paw prints. She heard a sound, guttural, low, on a frequency she had first heard inside the cabin's makeshift den, the call the bear used for the cub. It came from close by, very close. Martha froze. The cub appeared at the edge of the clearing, alone. For 3 seconds, Martha's heart stopped in an organized way, the kind of pause the body takes when it doesn't know how to process what the eyes are seeing. The cub stood in the snow, looking at her, bigger than he'd been 3 weeks ago, his paws steadier, his fur thickened out. Then the bear appeared 6 feet behind him. She had brought the cub to show her. Martha realized that later, not in the moment. In the moment she just stood on the porch, her hands stiff with cold and her eyes full of something she hadn't felt in a long time. The sensation of being seen, of existing beyond her own walls. The cub stayed at the tree line for maybe 2 minutes. Then the bear let out that low, guttural sound, and the 2 of them disappeared into the forest. Martha went inside, shut the door, leaned her back against the wood, and realized she was smiling. For the first time in how long she couldn't say, but there was a problem the smile couldn't fix, and that night, as she portioned out the last pounds of flour, Martha looked at her own hands and knew that surviving another winter like this wasn't guaranteed. The sacrifice had been worth every second, but the toll was still being collected. 6 weeks past the rescue, the tiger began to change its tune. Not the weather. An Alaskan winter doesn't bargain with the calendar, but there was something different in the quality of the light spilling through the kitchen window in the mornings. A slightly shifted angle Martha recognized after 22 years living there. It was the kind of shift only someone who's stayed long enough in one place learns to read. Not spring yet, far from it. Just winter communicating that it wasn't eternal. Martha woke up that morning and did something she hadn't done in weeks. She filled 2 mugs. She stared at them for a moment, hers and the one that had replaced Arthur's, both on the table. Then she sat down, drank hers, and let the other one go cold. It wasn't a gesture of sorrow. It was the kind of gesture that comes when a wound is closing, not open. You can touch it without flinching. Her hands had improved. Not healed. Arthritis doesn't heal. She knew that without any doctor having to confirm it. But the worst of the inflammation had passed with the hot cloth protocol, and she had recovered most of her grip strength. She could hold the axe again. She could close her fingers around the handle of the iron hook without the spasm that had dropped Arthur's mug weeks prior. The bedroom chair was still in one piece. It had been spared by a fraction of an inch of necessity. The wood had lasted exactly long enough, thanks to a rationing regimen that had cost Martha 9 pounds of body weight and more sleep than she'd admitted to Alex. But it was whole. And Martha looked at it sometimes with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has won a battle no one else knew was being fought. Alex had come to visit her in the 5th week. First visit in months. The snow had buried the dirt road at the start of winter, and he had made the 34-mile drive in an F-150 with chains, bringing flour, salt, oil, and a box of joint supplements his wife had set aside unasked. Martha had opened the door and stared at him for a second, without saying anything. Then she turned and went to put water on to boil. Alex noticed the paw prints around the cabin immediately. He walked the perimeter with his hands in his pockets, counting the tracks, analyzing the spacing. He stayed quiet for a long stretch, a silence Martha recognized in him. It was the silence he kept when recalculating what he thought he knew. "Does she come back often?" he asked when he came inside. "Not always, but often enough for me to know when she's been here." "Martha!" He sat at the table, hands wrapped around his mug. "This is not normal bear behavior." "I know. An adult sow doesn't repeatedly circle a human cabin without territorial or food motivations. That's not in any book." "I know, Alex." He fell silent for another moment. Then, "Are you afraid?" Martha weighed the question with the gravity it deserved. "No, and that does strike me as strange." Alex drank his coffee without replying, but before he left, when he was already back at the truck with the engine warming up, he stepped back out, walked up to Martha on the porch, and stood in the snow looking at her. "You did an impossible thing," he told her. "I needed to say that in person." Martha didn't answer, but she didn't look away. That was enough for both of them. It was the following afternoon that the bear returned with the cub for the second time. Martha was chopping wood, finding her rhythm again, hands aching but obeying, when she heard the low, guttural sound at the edge of the clearing. She lowered the axe, turned slowly. The two of them were there. But this time, there was a difference that made Martha exhale slowly through her nose before fully taking it in. The cub had grown, not drastically. It had been weeks, not months, but the growth was visible in the width of his shoulders, in the firmness with which his paws sank into the snow without the imbalance of those early days, in the way he stood still without the shakiness of the cub Martha had held to her chest. He looked like he'd doubled his weight, maybe more. And the white patch behind his left ear was still there, precise, unmistakable. The cub stood looking at Martha for a few seconds. Then he took 2 steps toward her. The bear didn't react. Martha stayed absolutely motionless, not out of fear, but from the awareness that any movement could shatter something she didn't want shattered. The cub stopped, sniffed the air in her direction. Then he took a step back and stood next to his mother. "You remember me," Martha said softly. It wasn't a question. They stayed like that for maybe 10 minutes. Martha standing in the clearing with the axe at her feet, the two of them at the edge of the woods. There was no tension. There was a shared quality of presence that Martha couldn't accurately name, but recognized as something she had felt only a few times in her life, the feeling of being in the right place at the right time, without having planned either. Then the bear made the guttural sound, and the two turned back toward the forest. The cub looked back once before vanishing among the pines. Martha stood in the clearing until the sound of their paws in the snow faded completely. Then she picked up her axe, set the next log, and went back to chopping wood with the same rhythm as before. But there was a lightness to her swing that hadn't been there that morning. Alex radioed that night, as he had every day since his visit. "How was your day?" "They came back," Martha said. "The cub is growing." A pause. "How is he doing?" "Strong." She considered for a second. "He's getting strong." Alex stayed quiet for a moment longer than usual. Then, with a tone in his voice Martha rarely heard, "Martha, I think you've made a friendship no human being has ever made before." Martha looked out the window. The clearing was empty and white under the overcast sky. "I don't think I'm the one who made it," she said. "I think it was her." She turned off the radio. She sat in the kitchen for a long moment, hands curled around the warm mug, the stove crackling, Arthur's photo on the wall. The winter was outside, but inside there was something she couldn't quite name. Not the warmth of firewood, not the warmth of memory, a different heat, the kind that comes when you realize the world still has room to surprise you. She had stopped counting the days since the cub left, not because she had forgotten, because she had stopped needing to count. Something was about to happen, however, that Martha didn't know yet. Something that would prove that what began in that ice crevice hadn't ended when the cabin door swung shut. It had never ended. It happened on an afternoon without warning. There was no sign, no unusual sound, no shift in the wind, none of those small anticipations the bush sometimes offers before an event occurs. It was an afternoon like any other. Low sky, weak light, the usual cold bearing down on everything. Martha was crossing the clearing carrying 2 logs under her left arm. The ice was slick on that patch, a thin sheet formed overnight over compacted snow, invisible against the white. She stepped on it blindly. Her foot shot out to the right, her torso pitched the opposite way, and the impact with the ground arrived before she had time to process that she was falling. Her left ankle folded under her body weight. Martha lay in the snow. For a few seconds, she just tried to breathe. The shock of the impact had knocked the wind out of her, and she needed a few full cycles before assessing the extent of what had happened. She tried to plant her ankle on the ground. The pain hit immediate and sharp, the kind that leaves no room for doubt. Fracture. She knew what a fracture felt like. She had broken her right wrist 12 years ago, falling off the barn ladder in the summer. She knew the sound. She knew the quality of the pain. Martha lay back in the snow and did what was necessary. She did the math. The cabin was 30 yards away. The radio was inside. Alex was 34 miles away. The temperature was hitting 60 below and dropping with the late afternoon. With no movement, no body heat generated, she had minutes before the cold started doing its work. She tried to drag herself. Elbows dug into the snow, hauling her torso forward, her ankle dragging uselessly behind. She made it maybe 6 feet before realizing the pace wasn't enough, that the cold was sinking in faster than she could advance, that her arms, her hands, joints, muscles that had already given everything they had over weeks of rationing didn't have the reserves required. She stopped, stayed still in the snow, staring at the cabin 28 yards away. 28 yards was an absurd distance to die over, but Martha had lived long enough in the taiga to know distance isn't what kills you. Temperature is, and the temperature did not negotiate. "Arthur," she said quietly. She didn't ask for anything. She just said his name, as she did when she needed to remember she had been loved. The sound came from the right, heavy, rhythmic, unhurried. Martha turned her head slowly. The bear entered the clearing with her cub at her side, bigger now, winter coat fully out, paws planting firmly in the snow. They stopped 10 feet from Martha. The bear lowered her snout, sniffed the air, sniffed toward the ankle. Then she did something Martha had never seen and would never be able to accurately describe to anyone later. She lay down in the snow next to her. The heat arrived instantly, not as a glowing coal, not as a shock, but as a living wall of warmth that placed itself between Martha and the freezing air with the solidity of something that had chosen to be there. The bear's thick fur pressed against Martha's side was warm in the way only living bodies are warm, with a heartbeat, with breath, with presence. The cub stood 6 feet away, watching. Martha rested her hand on the bear's coat. Then, with a slowness her ankle made inevitable, she started to move. The bear didn't flinch. She stayed absolutely still, a brace that hadn't been asked for, but had been offered with a precision lacking any explanation in animal behavior textbooks. 28 yards. Martha covered them in an amount of time she couldn't begin to guess. Leaning into the thick fur, dragging her ankle, the bear moving with her step by step right to the 2 porch stairs. Right to the door. Martha went inside. The door swung shut. She rested her forehead against the wood and stayed like that for a long moment, ankle throbbing, her body warming back up, eyes closed. Outside she heard their heavy paw steps walking away into the snow, slowly, unhurried. Alex answered the radio on the second ring. Martha told him with a different voice, not broken, but altered. The kind of voice of someone who's just understood something that doesn't have simple words. When she finished, there was a long pause on the radio. Then Alex's voice came through quietly, with a quality Martha had rarely heard in him. "Martha, you saved her, and she saved you." A pause. "There's a word for that, you know." Martha rested her back against the door, looked at Arthur's photo on the wall. "I know," she said. "It's called life. There is a lie the modern world repeats so often it's become truth, that compassion is a luxury for those who have enough, that you need to be safe to be generous, that you must have surplus to give." Martha was 73 years old, had arthritis in her hands, and rations for 3 weeks. She had a surplus of nothing. And it was exactly her, not the armed hunter, not the equipped researchers, not the connected neighbor on the radio, who stepped down those 2 porch stairs and went. Those who had everything walked past. The one who had almost nothing stayed. There is a justice in that no human law can write down. It just happens, with the silent precision of things that are true before they are understood. I think about Martha sometimes. About what she must have felt during those 23 minutes with the iron hook in the ice, her hands screaming, the mother bear motionless behind her. There was zero guarantee that it would end well. There was no contract, no logic, no nothing but a gesture offered across every boundary of species or reason. And when I think about what came after, her in the snow, ankle shattered, the cold closing in, and that massive warmth arriving at her side, I feel I understand something about the world I can't explain accurately, but which I recognize as true. Goodness sent without a return address finds its way back, always, in ways we couldn't have planned in 1,000 tries. And you? If that bear had stood on your porch, looking at you like that, would you have opened the door? Really think about it before you answer. Feel, protect, respect. Out there, somewhere in the Alaskan taiga, there is an ice crevice covered in snow. You wouldn't be able to tell it apart from any other crack in the white ground. There's no marker, no plaque. The snow has buried everything with the indifference nature holds for the stories that unfold within it. But if you could see the ground around it, you'd find something. 2 large paw prints and 1 smaller print side by side heading toward the forest. And next to the crevice, the gouges of an iron hook on the edge of the ice, made by hands that ached, but went anyway. Sometimes the only guidebook the world needs is this: hands that ache and go anyway, because on the other side of any abyss, of ice, of fear, of species, there might be someone just waiting to see if you will show up. Martha showed up. And the world paid her back with the only currency that has no price tag: warmth.